Bonjour à tous. Bonjour Nicole. Bonjour ERIN.
Bonjour.
Bienvenue.
Ah, merci. Nous sommes au stade là avec vous aujourd'hui.
Voilà, vous avez bien compris, effectivement, les dames vont parler en anglais parce que la phrase a été apprise par cœur juste avant. Nicole, vous êtes directrice générale de B3.8 and you are the director general of B3.8 and you will explain to us what that means. And you, Erin, you actually represent here the company Interface. Donc, effectivement, Nicole, directrice générale de B3.8 et Erin qui va nous parler au nom de la société Interface. Elles vont nous parler d'un projet qui est né en 2016 qui s'appelle en anglais Factory as a Forest, ce qui pourrait être traduit comme usine en tant que forêt. L'inspiration de la nature, du biomimétisme. Ce projet, j'ai dit, il est né en 2016 et il a fait sensation l'année dernière par 2 fois à Buenos Aires et à Vancouver lors de l'événement qui s'appelle Sustainable Brands, ce qui veut dire les marques soutenables. Ma première question à Erin et à Nicole les concerne personnellement. On a assez souvent les intervenants qui nous parlent de ce qu'elles font au niveau professionnel, ou ils font au niveau professionnel. Mais on se demande parfois, qu'est-ce que font ces gens-là en tant que personne, en tant qu'individu? Donc, ça sera ma première question. So the question for you ladies, you speak about the factory as a forest. How about you two? What do you do, if I paraphrase it, as ladies, as if you were a meadow? What do you do, Nicole, to actually be sustainable in your behavior? And then it will be your turn, Erin.
I'll answer that with 2 parts. First, I think like a lot of people hearing what Tom was sharing yesterday about the plastics and what you were just hearing hits me very personal. When you hear statistics like there'll be more plastic in the ocean than fish, it really is painful to know that that's something that you may be contributing to. So I think like a lot of people, I've taken a good reflection upon what are the products in my home, what are the things that I'm putting in, on, and around me and with my family. So 60% of the ocean plastic is actually comes from personal care products. So I challenged my family if we could remove plastics from our personal care. We've successfully done so with our toothbrush, or toothpaste, floss, and our face products. So we've done that. So that's been a small win. And I know that that most of the plastics are coming from these small 5 rivers in Asia, and what we do in the US might not have impact. But I think to Tom's point yesterday, it's this notion of we vote with our wallet, and that even though my personal impact might be small, I'm making that conscious choice and I'm demonstrating my value. The second part of that, kind of in line with what we'll be talking about today, is I'm really making a conscious effort right now as a human to pause and to not go through life as a checklist of things that I need to do, but to really walk through every day with kind of taking in nature, to really understand what is it that's around me, what are the benefits that this brings to me that I might not be thinking about when I'm rushing from one meeting to one meeting and picking up groceries and cooking dinner and taking care of my child. So that would be the second part of it, is to really just take some pause.
That kind of step back that he was talking about yesterday.
Exactly.
Effectivement, Tom Saki, si vous étiez là ici, il a parlé beaucoup de cette capacité à un peu prendre du recul sur la vie. And you, Erin?
Sure. I live in Atlanta, Georgia, which is a region where we think a lot about water and the lack of water. So at home, we focus a lot on how do we not use water. So we've kind of redesigned the landscaping in our yard And when I say redesigned, you know, it's my husband and I ripping up the lawn and putting in new plants so that we don't have to water. We don't have a sprinkler system. We rely on rain barrels. And then in our house, you know, we try to sort of think about what is it that we can do to reduce water. So we don't actually use a dishwasher, we use the sink. Here's an interesting thing. Most Americans nowadays wash their dishes on the fly, meaning they turn on the tap, they put a plate under it, they wash it. The water is constantly running. They actually use more water that way than they would in a highly efficient dishwasher. So literally, we have a bowl that when we turn on the sink and wait for it to be hot, we use that bowl. We use that to water the plants. So I think really simple things that we can do to kind of get focused on not being so wasteful.
Donc, effectivement, des actions qui montrent qu'elles réfléchissent dans leur action personnelle. Bougeons vers le projet lui-même, Factory as a Forest. Elles vont nous parler, effectivement, elles vont utiliser beaucoup de la notion de biomimétisme qui plaît à la plupart des gens. C'est un buzzword, c'est un mot qui est sexy et qu'on utilise. Mais si on parle de biomimétisme en tant que tel, il faut aussi se rendre à l'évidence que la nature a besoin d'une certaine redondance, d'une certaine inefficacité. Et ça, c'est beaucoup moins sexy parce qu'on est tous d'accord que nos sociétés aujourd'hui exigent de nous tous à être super efficaces et super spécialisés. Et donc, la question pour les dames est la suivante. Qu'est-ce qu'elles font quand elles travaillent avec les managers aujourd'hui pour que cette notion systémique soit aussi acceptée par les managers? The question is, ladies, when we speak about what you're doing, we also speak not only about the biomimetism, biomimicry, but we also speak about this redundancy in the nature, which is necessary. How do you convince the managers to actually accept this notion when you work with them in companies? What do you do at Interface, for example?
Sure. I mean, you know, the story of our company is that the mindset shift started with the founder actually late in life when he was 60 years old. And, you know, he had been trained as an engineer and fundamentally realized the way he had been managing the business was wrong. And he realized that through reading a book. And he immediately said, if I'm going to transform this billion-dollar industrial manufacturing company, I'm going to need some environmental advisors to help. So the first thing he did was kind of retrain, relearn, reach out to sort of learn. So one of the people he reached out to was the woman who wrote the book Biomimicry, that created the organization that NICOLE works for, Janine Benias. And we've subsequently brought that training and that mindset shift directly into our organization. We train our factory employees on biomimicry thinking. We train them on system thinking. We bring environmental speakers into our environment, not to make people environmentalists, but to understand how we will implement that thinking in our business process.
And you, in your practice at B 3.8, what do you do to convince the managers to accept this notion, which is not sexy for them, which shows that there will be not high efficiency which is required?
I think one of the things that we do quite early in the conversation is make it a business conversation. We also orient our conversation to who it is we're talking to. So if we're talking to a business manager, we talk about the economics of it. We talk about the return on investment. We talk about the fact that looking to nature is not something that's woo-woo or esoteric, but it's something that is actually quite smart in the fact that you're essentially de-risking your innovation process. You know, we're looking to strategies that have been time tested. So we lean into that in terms of why you need to do this is smart for business. It's not something that's trendy or, you know, the topic du jour, but it's actually a long-term strategy.
Okay. Ladies, I believe the floor is yours now. Please walk us through Factory as a Forest.
Okay, merci. So I want to start just by a quick poll. How many of you are familiar with biomimicry? Okay, a handful. Great. So we have a formal definition, which is the conscious emulation of nature's genius. That's the one that we use within our organization. But if you really break it down, bio, meaning life, and mimicry, to imitate, that is essentially what we're doing, is we are imitating nature. Our company name, Biomimicry 3.8, stands for the 3.8 billion years of life on Earth. So the very first organism appeared 3.8 billion years ago. So at our company, we lean into that knowledge, that wisdom, that 3.8 billion years of time-tested strategy to help think differently about the problems that we're facing today. Our company has had the pleasure of doing this work for over 15 years, solving some of the most vexing challenges that we face today, using this knowledge, using these time-tested strategies to help inform new thinking, to create a new mind shift around how we go about solving the problems that we face today. Most people are probably familiar with biomimicry from a product perspective. So, for example, this is the Shinkansen bullet train that was designed in Japan in 1989. And for example, this is a kind of textbook biomimicry case. Have any of you heard of this case? Okay, I'll share the story of it. So when they designed the train, it was very much like a traditional train that was a flat front. And when it would travel through tunnels, because it was a bullet train, it traveled at 167 miles per hour. I don't know the conversion of that. Very fast. And so when it would go through a tunnel, it would make a sonic boom. And the train traveled through residential areas. And so this was quite problematic from a noise pollution standpoint. The designer of this train also happened to be a bird watcher. And he noticed that when the kingfisher dove into the water, it was able to do so with virtually no splash. And so this piqued his interest. How could we actually emulate that design, that shape, to create a better design for the train? So they integrated that design and tested it. And what they found is that the train actually, by using this design, it took 20% less energy to operate the train, and the train operated at a 10% faster speed, a speed improvement, and it eliminated the noise reduction. So this is an example of how we can look to nature, how we can look at how these species actually use design and shape and function to perform more effectively and efficiently, and we can translate that into human design to solve the challenges that we face today. So that's a kind of classic example. There's we have a whole video on this. If you look, if you search Vox video biomimicry, this will come up. It's kind of a 6-minute video that explains how this design came to be. So that's what biomimicry is. And today we're going to talk a little bit more broadly about biomimicry. We're oftentimes people talk about products that come from biomimicry, but we're going to kind of expand it a little bit, and we're going to talk about how it applies to buildings and communities, and what that relationship is with how that affects humans and how they perform in those spaces, and how that can actually bring economic vitality to the space, the company, and the communities in which they operate. One of the things that's kind of unique about biomimicry is that we're looking to nature not as a natural resource that we can extract, but something that we can learn from, and that nature can serve as our model and our mentor and our measure, that it actually gives us data that we can work from, and that's what we're going to talk about today as well. So our company started working together, as ERIN mentioned, shortly after Janine Benyus, the founder of our company, wrote her seminal book, Biomimicry, Innovation Inspired by Nature. And it was then that the pivotal founder of Interface reached out to Janine, as ERIN mentioned, and they created this Eco Dream Team to really transition the company from a carpet company, which is working in an industry known for toxicity and waste. And the founder of Interface set out a mission to transform their industry from one that was polluting to one that could actually be zero waste. And that was his challenge to the company. How could we be a company that's zero waste? And so our work really became integrated into Interface's mission to achieve zero waste. And that's kind of how we first began. And one of our first kind of entries into the company was with their product design team, because their founder, Ray Anderson, really invited the company to think more broadly, to be more open about what sustainability could mean. Their lead designer invited us, our company, to be part of a workshop to redesign what carpet floor could look like. So when our team of biologists got there, they didn't sit in a boardroom and create whiteboards of what new carpet tile could look like. They went outside. They took a walk through the forest they took a walk through the forest, and they observed that the forest floor had this beautiful but random pattern. There weren't structured linear lines and straight pathways. It was a randomness. And that randomness was rather beautiful. And so could they actually translate that into their design of their carpet tile? And they did. And they launched a line called Entropy. That was in early 2000 that was launched. Since then, it is over 25% of this thinking, the randomness pattern design, is now represented in over 25% of the product line, which translates into over 30% of the company's annual revenue. So it's $1 billion company. So this thinking, this openness, this new way of approaching design actually helped Interface redesign what their entire kind of process was about creating new product. And that was an early win for Biomimicry because they were successful with the creation of a new product line that was quite successful from a revenue perspective. It really helped kind of lay the foundation for, oh, this new way of thinking could be quite effective for us. And that's kind of how our journey began as a company. And because Interface is constantly pushing the envelope of what's possible, in 2014, when they realized that they were going to reach their zero waste goals, we started a conversation of what's the next level? What's the next bar that the company can take it to? And that's when we met in 2015 to kind of dream up this project, Factory as a Forest. So I'm going to turn it over to ERIN to kind of share that story.
Great. Hi, everyone. So Nicole did a great job for me of describing who we are. But Interface is a $1 billion company that makes flooring products, right? You may not know it because we don't have a huge residential business, but if you've been in an airport, a university, or a commercial office, you probably walked on our products. It's carpet squares, it's LVT, but it's also rubber. We have a huge business where we put rubber in transportation trains and train stations, and the products we make is not important because we're not selling them. What's really important to know is that we were a 50-year-old company who had no focus on the environment. And we started 25 years ago and have gotten to the point where we've been able to deeply reduce the impacts of our business. And the point is, if we can do it, any company can do it. Any organization can do it. We were a group of American engineers who had never thought about the environment. And what changed it for us was we lost a huge project. California in the early 1990s was leading the United States in terms of the green building movement. And we were competing for a job in California, one of the first green buildings ever, before the green building standards existed. And we lost the project. And so our CEO, the founder of the business at the time, said to our salespeople, "What did we do wrong?" And they said, this architect was asking us, what is our company doing for the environment? And we didn't have an answer. We had no idea how to answer that because we weren't doing anything for the environment and we weren't even thinking about it. So that transformation is what kind of started at Interface 25 years ago that led to biomimicry, that led to where we are. And our founder, who passed away in 2011, was famous for saying this phrase back to skeptics, particularly our investors, particularly Wall Street, particularly investors in Europe, who would say, well, what's the business case for doing this? Doesn't it cost a lot of money to go green? What about, all the recycled materials you use in the products? What about all the renewable energy you want to buy? What's the business case for that? And he said, what's the business case for running a company in a way that destroys the biosphere, that fundamentally weakens the life systems which we all depend on? And so that's really kind of what's at the heart of our company and what really led us to focus on where we need to go. So we really think about that as we design products, but also as we design spaces. And it was really on our mind as we were thinking about how do we take the factory spaces now that have gotten quite far to have zero impact, and think about what's beyond zero impact. And that really led us to this interesting exploration around, could we actually design factory spaces where our biggest operational impact is? We have 9 factories around the world, beyond a zero footprint space, right? Because zero footprint is about how do we build something in a way that's not damaging the environment? But that's not the aspiration maybe we all want to hold. I mean, what would be beyond that? What would be creating spaces that would be positive? So we'll start here today with imagination. So imagine if we could build all our hotels like this one in Singapore, our hospitals, which is the middle space, and our factories as spaces that actually don't just kill us or harm the local community, but actually gave us something back, actually improved the performance of people in them, improved their capability to heal, improved the opportunity we have to connect our employees with the natural community and the spaces around them. So, imagine if we could do that. That was at the heart of the beginning of this project. And so it's not just spaces that will actually have a lot of plants and look fantastic, but it's spaces that beyond and underneath them from a design perspective are built to perform like nature, not just to look like nature, but to provide the same sorts of services. Beyond just the efficiency of nature, but things like cycling water, storing carbon, filtering air. So it's about imagining these amazing spaces, though, that use natural principles to provide the same sorts of functions. So it's kind of one step beyond this idea of a green building or a more efficient building or a building that looks great to work in. Because we know that when we actually put plants in buildings, when we give people windows, there is this natural connection to nature that's fantastic. This is one step beyond that in terms of actually performing like nature, making systemic choices, engineering choices, technology choices that will allow your building to actually do things that nature does. So we're going to dig into that a little bit today. And I think the benefits are quite obvious. These are not fantastic pictures. This is actually a hotel in Singapore, and I'll stand out of the way, that's designed like a V. And the point of this is to, when they were sort of imagining what would be an ideal space for people to recuperate, for people to kind of reconnect and heal, one of the central principles was when people have access to nature, data now tells us that they heal faster. They spend actually less time in the hospital convalescing if they can have access to a natural environment. So this was kind of built around a central corridor of greenery with this amazing pond and park next to it. And there's data from this hospital in Singapore now showing that people recover faster in environments like this. But this is also a fantastic example of where they've made choices around the design to funnel water, to actually use materials that will cool better. One of these wings, actually the one on the far right, has no air conditioning. It's in Singapore. And it's designed to sort of, with the materials, with the way the building is oriented, and with the engineering decisions, to cool. And in an interesting sort of opportunity, Singapore is a place where central healthcare is not provided. So you're allowed 3 levels when you go into this hospital. You can convalesce in an air-conditioned wing, or in the nature-conditioned wing. Super interesting. So that's what we're kind of asking you guys to do. Kind of imagine this. What would it actually look like? Think about kind of the opportunities we have, understand the benefits, and then once we make that mindset shift, we're going to talk a little bit about what are the tools and the practices through some of the pieces that we've designed. What are some of the tools and the practices you can actually use to take this into your work and your community? Because there are large companies aside from Interface. This is a great example of what Google is doing and trying to implement this sort of framework on all of their campuses around the world. And there are loads of other organizations who are now saying, it's beyond just a really cool space with plants. We need to integrate this into our global real estate decisions. So it is something that if we can do it as a tiny billion-dollar carpet company, you can do it. If Google can do it, any office can do it, any community can do it. And so I'm going to pass it off to Nicole to kind of get us started as we really explore this idea of not just can we create great spaces, but how do we create spaces that do this?
Great. So one of the kind of a couple data points to add to what Erin said. So 15 minutes outside will decrease your cortisol level, right? So that's your stress hormone. 45 minutes outside will actually improve cognitive performance. So if you were to think about that and help us imagine, so if you were walking outside and you were walking along a river corridor and you had nature integrated into your everyday life, every place that you walk by, how would you feel? How would you act? How would you perform? Right? This is what we're kind of inviting, and this is what we piloted and demonstrated. So to kind of get us into that imagining space, what we'd like you to do is take a minute, close your eyes. Everyone, I can see you, so close your eyes. Take a deep breath. Now imagine if you could transport yourself to anywhere in this world at this moment, where would it be? When you're there, what do you see? What do you hear? Is it the ocean? River? What do you smell? Salty air? Crisp? Feel the crisp air? And really, how do you feel? You happy? You content? Calm? At ease? Now open your eyes. How many of you, when you did that visualization, were outside in nature? Okay, so what this tells us, so this is my space. This is what I think of. I'm from Montana in the US, which is home of Glacier National Park. It's just 2 hours from where I live. And this is where I think of, and all of you thought of someplace in nature. And what that tells us is how important nature is to us as humans. And I think what happened is that the Industrial Revolution decoupled us from nature. It created nature as something that we dominate, something that we extract, something that we use for short-term monetary gains. But really, we are nature. It is integrated into who we are. It is coded in us. And it is very much part of how we perform at our best is when nature is around us and we're integrated in it versus removed from it. Most of us in our lifetime, we will spend, as data tells us, 70% of our life indoors. This is not what we are designed to do. This is not kind of who we are as humans. We are supposed to be outside. So if we take our buildings and if we make them as a place that is more integrated with nature, informed by nature, inspired by nature, what does that do to our daily life and our experience? We are the only species on this planet that has to protect ourselves from ourselves, right? And if you think about nature, it's really the original circular economy. There is no waste in nature. Everything is a feedstock. Everything is a nutrient. So what can we learn from that? When we're thinking about circular design and circular economy, And when we think about it at a systems level, what is it that we can learn from nature if we actually look at ecosystems and how they function in this kind of symbiotic relationship, and that everything is providing value to the function of that ecosystem? What can we extrapolate from that to help us think about how we're designing our systems today? So one of the things, first, by the way, I have to say, this is the first, so Erin and I have done this talk a couple times, Factory as a Forest. This is literally the first time we're giving this talk in a forest, and it's pretty freaking amazing. So thank you to the 360 team for pulling this off. But so what we've learned is, so these forests, we can actually measure how they perform. We can measure how much carbon is being sequestered. We can measure how much water is being filtered. And we can quantify that into data such as this. We can look at the water collection through storms. We can look at how water is purified by the percent pollutants captured. So we can start to actually understand and quantify what's happening in our forests. And this vision that we're talking about really stemmed from our founder, Janine Benyus, when she kind of laid out this vision of if our buildings and our cities could actually function like the forest next door, if they could capture carbon, capture pollutants in the same way that the forest next door, isn't that what sustainable design should be? Isn't that what it could be? And shouldn't we start thinking that way, of raising the bar, of that these high-performing ecosystems around us are delivering all these services to us for free, right? They clean the air, the water, provide soil, and we pay nothing for that. I mean, this is the whole kind of foundation of natural capital cost and integration of true cost accounting, right? Like that's that kind of whole foundation of thinking. So this was really the vision that kind of led us to start thinking about, what if we designed for ecosystem services, the services that the forest and nature provide to us? What if we started designing to emulate that? And what this does, it kind of takes our mind shift away from this notion of doing less bad. So, right, like we have these goals of reduction, of reducing carbon, reducing pollutants, which is this kind of, as Erin mentioned, it's kind of taking us to this zero space, which can kind of be not exciting or not aspirational, right? Like, so what if we imagined of like, what would it look like to be generous? What if we gave in the same way that the forests do? What if we actually were to increase the number of carbons, the amount of carbon sequestered? Increase pollinator habitat. Like, this is really starting to look at it from this positive mindset. And that's kind of the mindset that helped us develop this framework and thinking. And it wasn't that using ecological knowledge is something that we've been doing, architects have been doing for a long time. So that's not the new idea here. The new idea was, how could we integrate this into a framework that could be scaled? And that's what Interface really challenged us with, is that they were 100% on board for rethinking how they could integrate biomimicry into their carbon take-back strategy. But what they challenged us with is that we have, factories around the world. Like, we need to be able to do this everywhere we go. And that's what kind of motivated our team to kind of develop this process. And it's rather straightforward. So it's kind of a 4-part process. The first thing we do is look to a high-performing ecosystem within close proximity of the community or building site. And that's what makes this process unique, right? So we're not just pulling random numbers out and saying you must reduce your carbon and greenhouse gas emissions by 30%. What we're doing is we're measuring the forest next door with relative close proximity to say, well, this is how your forest, and by the way, when I say forest, I'm using that broadly in terms of whatever natural environment. Like, so if you are in the desert, we would be measuring that ecosystem. So we're essentially measuring a high-performing ecosystem in that location. And we're looking at how it performs. And we're using that as our foundation. That's our data set. And so once we identify that, we measure it, we quantify how it performs. We then quantify the site, the building or community, And then we essentially do a performance gap analysis. How is the factory, or excuse me, how is the site performing? How is the forest performing? And we identify that gap, and that gap is what we're solving for, right? We're solving for what are the design interventions that allow us to shorten that gap. And that's where we create our design strategies. Once we know the problem that we have to solve, there's so many brilliant designers that are helping us figure out, like, what does that look like in architecture, in systems, and engineering to kind of eliminate those gaps. And then from there we implement, and then we kind of measure and monitor over time to see what does that actually do? How does that actually perform? So we start with this really aspirational goal, and then work towards that. And what we're going to do is kind of walk you through what that process looked like for interface with our pilot project, so you can kind of see in specificity these kind of 4 steps.
Thanks, Nicole. And that, by the way, is exactly how I sold this to my CEO. when I said, hey, we have this amazing idea about how we will progress the thinking of the company on sustainability from doing no harm to doing positive, right? So for any of you who are kind of in the business community, or maybe work in the local government community, there is this shift going on in the world around sustainability, moving from the reductionist mindset of 25 years ago, which is sustainability is just companies, just cities actually doing less bad, to the move towards positive. So when I think about companies like Denon and Patagonia and Interface, and I see what's happening in the green building movement, this shift is absolutely happening about companies saying we actually have to go beyond zero, whether it's in the context of carbon or something else. So, I sort of said to our CEO, it's time for us to move to positive, and the best way to sort of present something to your CEO is to really simplify it. I found that's the best way to get projects sold. So I sort of said, it's a simple 4-step process. We find a high-performing forest, we measure what it does, we determine what those numbers are, and then we actually benchmark our company against it in terms of the existing performance, and we figure out what the design interventions are to get there. So, I mean, it is widely applicable to cities, to a local project that you're doing, to a university project. So let's kind of dig in a little bit. The first was, we're getting a little more nature than we expected. The first is really, how do we identify the local reference system? So what we did was we brought the Biomimicry Institute in and actually said, using data, using kind of the local place we are, which is in the United States, in the southeastern United States, identify this performing ecosystem for us. It happened to be a longleaf pine forest, right? And then the next thing they did is they physically went out and measured what it did. How much rainfall happens on an annual basis? How much water gets cycled? How much carbon is stored in the soil? And then they built a set of metrics for that. So, right, that is something we can do if we have access to that data. So that's step number 2. Quantify what that system does. Okay, quantify what that system does, right? These systems are really complex. They can do 65 things. And so the next sort of thing we had to say is, as a company that has a manufacturing campus that's pretty big, that has a big parking lot, that has a couple big production buildings, of those 65 things that a forest can do, what do we have the capacity to deliver in terms of performance? So we had to take those 65 functions that an ecosystem has and prioritize areas that we could actually design towards. So not surprisingly, we picked things like carbon, water, atmosphere, biodiversity. And so we said, we want to understand what that local ecosystem does for biodiversity, and then how we set a goal for our factory to deliver that same level of biodiversity, or for the factory to deliver the same level of rainfall, or water filtration, or carbon sequestration. So it actually is about getting to a number, because we've got to give our engineers, our factory managers, a goal and target that they can hit and we can design towards. So that translation of looking at the ecosystem ultimately gets us to the point where we're setting targets on water, atmosphere, carbon. The next step, as Nicole said, is then you benchmark the facility against that. So the good news for Interface is we had spent 25 years creating very efficient factories that were almost zero waste, that had reduced the greenhouse gas emissions in the business 96%. We've reduced the water usage in our processes 91%. We've reduced waste 92%, right? But we weren't positive. I mean, we were just using 92% less water than we had. So the new goal would be, through rainwater capture, how do we actually use the water we need in the process, but then make sure that we're putting water back into the ecosystem? That's the shift. So how do we go from a factory that is a zero footprint factory, so by using renewable energy, using resource efficient transportation, different commuting programs for employees, we had reduced the carbon at the factories. Now, how do we get to the place where we're sequestering carbon at those factories? And that requires you to look at very different things. That might be rooftop gardens on the factories. That might be getting rid of all of our parking lots that are asphalt and actually putting in grass. It might mean other things we can do for carbon sequestration. So that's the kind of analysis we do, is once we measure the high-performing ecosystem, we set the standards, then we sort of say to ourselves, what are the things that we can actually do to achieve that? And I'll be quite honest about saying, this could be a 2-year approach, it could be a 5-year approach, it could be a 15-year approach for our company. One thing that we were really lucky in doing is we had a $50 million upgrade in our US manufacturing plant that was happening already to sort of move machinery around, reinvest in logistics, and we were able to tack on like a $2 million ask of implementing this project to that larger bill. We had a fantastic opportunity, because normally getting $2 million to put in a green roof and to chop off the asphalt is a much harder sell, even as the head of sustainability. And so I think, you know, the last thing I want to leave you with in terms of the process is, now that we've done it, we can find ways to scale it within our business. So that analysis was first done at our US manufacturing plant in the southeastern United States. A year later, we decided to build a new headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia. And we actually said, look, this is totally scalable. We did this analysis for like a large factory, but we can take these principles and actually apply it to our new office building. So if we, you know, applied this thinking to the new office building that we ultimately created up there, and you'll see that like the forest strap on the outside of our building is meant to evoke the design approach we actually took, which was, if we were designing a forest, what are the functionalities we would invest in at the headquarters to make it deliver the same sorts of services? And God, if we were only in Atlanta, that's our cistern system, which like collects water and actually uses it to make sure that all of the water we use in the building, hand washing, going to the bathroom, and in the catering kitchen, actually is captured from the rainwater and put into a cistern down below the building in the basement. So, you know, we did this same approach and realized that in an urban environment, we have different opportunities. We don't have as much of a biodiversity opportunity, but we have a huge opportunity to make decisions and investments in the design and technology that would help us think about water and help us think about carbon. So we made some investments around rainwater collection and cistern in the building, as I already talked about. But we also, you know, made some investments that were all about reducing the site energy reduction. So we have some very efficient HVAC systems there. We made some investments in terms of the actual cost of energy. So we use renewable energy on this site by paying into a portion of a renewable energy fund that's funding generation for local resources in the southeastern United States. And so it's an example of, if we make this investment, if we make this shift, one of the things we all think about is, how do we scale this? I mean, I have 10 other plants around the world. So how is it that we can take this and apply it? And what's fantastic is we found that the analysis that we did for the factory could actually also help us when we think about designing one standalone office building in a built environment. And it gets back to the original piece that if we can do it, anybody in the built environment can do it. And we can actually, just by using a different tool and a different set of practices, deliver energy reduction, cost reduction that help us meet the carbon sequestration goals of the building. So that's how kind of it all ties back together. So I'm going to hand it back to Nicole to sort of close with a little bit about how this thinking is being used more broadly beyond just one company or one building.
Thanks, Sarah. Oh, okay, it's back on. So the important thing about this that we recognized in the process is that we needed it to scale, right? It couldn't just be one company who's pushing the envelope be able to do it. What could it look like at scale? So we worked with the city of Durban, South Africa. We're now currently working with C40 to look at how this would apply to cities and how we can integrate this thinking into city planning. And you can imagine that's important because right now we're building cities to kind of house the population growth. The statistic is something like a city the size of New York every 30 days is what we're building. So if you think about that's what we're building right now, how do we build in a better way? So for the project in South Africa, essentially to the point, we kind of measured where they needed to be, where they currently were at, and talked about the design interventions that would get them there. Right, so a lot of this is about scenario planning, and if we do design one, what is the local impact? If we do design two, how does that shift? How does that change? And so that's a big part of what this data enables us to do is actually look at the situational analysis to make better design decisions. Oops. One of the projects I'm most excited about right now is applying this work to schools. And we did a project called Campus as a Forest with a architecture firm out of Virginia in the United States, who's very progressive in kind of pushing what school design should look like. And so they invited us in to kind of help them think about the design of the school in the same way and how we could integrate nature into this new campus that they were building. So we did the same process in terms of took lessons from nature, ecological intelligence, understood kind of the biological mechanisms around that, identified those strategies and patterns, and started to see how we could integrate that into the design process, along with the metrics in terms of using this information to kind of help us shorten that performance gap. So, and here's kind of what that looked like, right? So we did the baseline assessment, measured the high-performing ecosystem, measured the campus site. We did the scenario planning of what would happen with different design alternatives. And it's kind of laid out, basically, at a site level, what those design recommendations would look like. So this was the original site, or this is the original site of the school. So it was a land that the school was able to purchase, but it had been logged, right? So it's been completely kind of removed. Nature has been removed from it. And then this was the redesign. If we integrate the knowledge of kind of the estuary around there and integrated kind of the processes and understandings and deep patterns from nature into the building design, what would that look like at a site level? But then also, what would it look like? This is the actual building design. So a cool thing about this project is that it took an elementary school, a middle school, and a high school, and a community space, which they did not have, and put it into one. So they created a campus. And that was kind of the key thing that, go back. So this was the site analysis, kind of the ecological intelligence of the place, how we integrate that into the new educational campus, kind of merging these schools and community, creating a learning village, and then creating a learning community. And for us, what was most exciting about this project is we oftentimes we geek out about the biology and the ecological knowledge, and we see that integrated in design, but oftentimes it goes unnoticed. But in this particular project, the ecological knowledge is actually integrated into the learning community, and that the school curriculum integrated that ecological-based knowledge into how the students learn about their place. Often these students have no experience with nature. So now their building becomes a teacher in the sense that the building and their interaction with that building is teaching them about nature. So I think for what we'd like to close with is that, this is, as we said, a mind shift think, and moving to a more positive space. And we need people who are interested and excited about this philosophy to take this back to your communities and really challenge, what would it look like if we designed a building that was informed by nature? What would it look like if we designed our community, our schools? And since the work that we've done with Interface, we've really had a growing kind of collection of people interested in this concept. And similar to how Tom was saying yesterday, we're working with large companies where we've invited Google and Microsoft and Ford and Walmart are kind of all coming together to talk about, well, what would this look like if we actually integrated this into the philosophy of our data centers, of our stores? And we're using kind of this framework and this thinking with these big companies so that we can demonstrate what's possible. But it's part of kind of this movement of generous. It takes everybody. And so what we really wanted to leave you with is this kind of invitation of how might you really think about design in the sense that it can create conditions that are conducive to all life. So that's what we'd like to leave you with. And
I'll be slightly more American in my ask. Is that okay?
Yes, yeah.
I mean, I'll be a little more direct. We need you. This sort of thinking needs to scale. We need people thinking about their role in the local community. If you sit on the board of a school district, if you're a parent with a child whose school is doing a renovation, if your office is thinking about this, if you're an architect or designer, if you're a community planner, we need you to start being advocates for this sort of thinking. The methodology exists. Case studies are out there. We're totally committed to helping you figure out how to do this, because ultimately this is the direction the world needs to move in. So I think it's not a leave you with, it's like a plea that we need you and we need you now.
We have 11 years to get this right? So
11 years
it's a plea.
to get this right.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.